All right, guys, this is your word of the day for April 15th. The first one should be easy for you, quarantine. We've been hearing a lot about that, but it's actually kind of got an interesting backstory. So, back in the day, whenever ships would come into port in Europe, uh, the goods would be put in quarantine, which meant that they were like held for 40 days to make sure nothing bad happened to them. And oftentimes, depending on where people were coming back from, if they were coming back from a region that was known to be disease ridden, then they would also have to spend 40 days in quarantine. So the word quarantine originates from the Italian word for 40, which means which is quaranta, which if you know Spanish should seem familiar, and so that's where the word quarantine comes from. Uh, our science fact of the day is another bit of wordplay, but it's basically the history of the word vaccine. So, vaccine actually comes from the term for cowpox, and that should make sense. Again, if you know Spanish, I think it comes from Latin actually, but it's the same basic root. Latin cow is vaca, just like in Spanish, and so cowpox was like vaccinia, I think. That was its scientific name. But basically, what happened was cowpox infected cows, and it caused basically these little bumps and pustules to show up on the cows. Milkmaids, so women that milked cows, would catch the cowpox, and it would get on their arms. And But there was another disease that was out at the time called smallpox, and smallpox looks like this. It's a very nasty looking disease. Basically, your entire body gets covered in these little bumps. Very nasty looking. It's that was the least offensive thing I could find. There's there's some that are just horrific where those bumps just cover the entire body. These milkmaids would only get them on their hands, and so they would have little scars on their hands, but their faces would be fine, and so that was like a big deal. The milkmaids would always brag that they got cowpox, so they're not going to get smallpox, so they won't have scarred faces. And so this one guy, one scientist, was listening in on this. He was 1700s, and he heard them, one day heard them bragging about this, so he decided to investigate, and he said, well, that's weird. Well, I wonder why they don't get smallpox. So he theorized that this cowpox was similar to smallpox, but your body built up an immunity to smallpox if you got cowpox, which is in fact what happened. So he would vaccinate people with cowpox. He would take cowpox, he would basically pop the pustules, and then stab you with them, like with a little needle, like prick you with it. So you would get cowpox, but when you got cowpox, you either didn't get smallpox or you got a much less virulent strain of smallpox, virulent attack of smallpox, and so the term vaccine came into play, and it all has to do with cows and milkmaids. Uh, History fact of the day: the Battle of Cannae. It's one of my favorite things to look at in history because it's just an amazing tactical victory, basically making a strength out of a weakness. And it was by Hannibal of Carthage against the Romans. The Romans had a much superior force. The numerically they had a much superior force, and so what he did, what Hannibal did, was he aligned his people, his men, in a staggered pattern, and then as the Roman army advanced, he had the front rows fall back and the side rows go forward. And so basically, what he did was he encircled the Romans and basically caused them to, like, basically caused them all to bunch up. And I mean, this is tragic. He killed 40,000 Romans, but it was, 2,000 years ago. So I think we're okay in making light of it. But basically, he basically turned his weakness into his strength. He tricked the Romans into thinking he was retreating, and they all charged in, thinking they were going to rout the Carthaginians, and then he encircled them and ended up slaughtering them in quite horrific fashion. Um, he did end up losing the war, but this is still a great victory, one of the most impressive. Book of the day, a little bit different. The Bread Bible. A little bit odd, I know, for me to be recommending something like this. It's a cookbook uh, on how to make bread, but it's amazing. It's got probably 100 different bread recipes in it. Some of them are a little bit iffy, like they're not iffy in terms of like whether they're true or not, but iffy in terms of whether you can do them or not. But most of them are pretty doable. And so in this time of physical separation, you might want to partake in bread making. And I looked on Amazon, and you can find the used copy for fairly cheap. $10-15. If you want a new one, I think it's about 40 or 50. They're pretty expensive, but get a used copy because it's just the same thing. And yeah, that's it. So go deer.